How do poets become poets? The answer may surprise you.
I didn't become a poet by getting an MFA. I became a poet by running high fevers, tramping through tropical jungles, dodging machine gun fire, being caught in volcanic eruptions, swarmed by army ants, stalked by vampire bats, threatened by poisonous snakes. And then there was reading.
How did jungle woman and bookworm come to inhabit the same body? How did they combine to make a little girl born in Indianapolis, Indiana, during the height of McCarthyism, into a short, scrappy woman who began writing poems at the age of 11 and never stopped? The answer is both simple and complex. The simple part is that I desperately wanted to get out of Indianapolis. About the time I turned 11, I started to realize that a lot of interesting things were happening somewhere else. I even heard rumors that in Paris, people sat around in things called cafes and talked about ideas. Paris, Rome, Antarctica, Mars, how despite an impaired sense of geography, I longed to see them firsthand. I imagine many of the children I went to school with also longed to go somewhere interesting, but I had an advantage. I knew that there were places so different from Indianapolis that they could not be described in ordinary words. And this is where it gets complex, because the thing that brought me this knowledge, the thing that did more than anything else to make me into a poet, was fever. But first, it almost killed me. The first time it happened, I was 6 months old. I don't remember any of the events of my near-death experience, but I'm told I turned blue and went into convulsions. According to my mother, I would have died, except that my father, who was completing his medical training in a military hospital, had access to penicillin, a drug not at the time available to civilians. The penicillin brought down my fever and saved my life, but fever was not done with me. The next time I nearly died was just before my 3rd birthday. I remember that experience well because it was the first time I saw how thin and bright the world could be. I remember lying on a green couch in an overheated room. It must have been winter because frost coated the window panes and snow lay on the bare branches of the trees in big lumps. My mother had given me a bottle of Coca-Cola on the principle that I needed to take in more fluids. My temperature must have been somewhere between 105 and 106 Fahrenheit because already I was experiencing that wonderful, detached, floating feeling I always get above 105 degrees. Just for the record, the path from 98.6 to 105 is nasty, filled with aches, pains, uncontrolled shaking, and the pure misery of sickness. But once you reach 105, everything changes. You start to feel irrationally happy. Your body becomes light and buoyant. By the time you get to 106, you begin to discover that you're incapable of worrying, even though everyone around you is frantic with fear. The best is yet to come. Teetering on the edge of 107 brings the real poetic gifts because a fever that high does something strange to your brain. As I lay on that green couch, warm, golden light, the kind you only see for a few moments at sunset, flooded our living room. My parents moved toward me so slowly that I could see their clothing billow out and collapse in an invisible wind. Bending over me, they lost their faces and floated toward the ceiling like huge birds. The Coke bottle on the coffee table multiplied into dozens of Coke bottles, which flew up and circled in a huge glassy aura around their heads. Behind my parents' bodies, the light turned into a veil composed of long, rainbow-colored ribbons. The veil expanded, consuming the green couch, the blankets, the windows, and my parents. Suddenly it parted, and I saw trees with red and gold leaves, impossible because it was the dead of winter, and little children stretching out their hands and calling to me. I couldn't have had much of a vocabulary at that age. Nevertheless, words suddenly streamed into my mind and came out of my mouth, combining and recombining into entirely new things. I believe this was the moment I was given the gift of poetry. Thus, although I received some of the building blocks for creating poems a little before my 3rd birthday, it would be years before I knew what a poem was, and many more years before I attempted to write one. When I did begin to write poetry at the age of 11, I soon realized I had 2 problems. First, I had no idea what I was doing, and worse yet, I had no control over my poems and no idea how to fix them when they went wrong. Being a practical sort, I decided to read as much poetry as possible and pick it apart and see how it was put together. I thought I could learn everything I needed to know in a few months, but of course I was wrong. Learning my craft took years. My second problem was that no matter how pretty my poems were or how cleverly I combined words, I didn't have anything significant to write about. I was a child. I was living in Indianapolis. I needed a subject. You might say I needed a life. If you don't have a life, I asked myself, what do you do? The answer seemed obvious. You borrow one. With this in mind, I plunged into the biographies of poets and novelists, determined to discover how their lives had inspired their work. Soon I discovered two things. First, the great poets and writers of the world did not, for the most part, live in Indianapolis. Second, they were all men. Male poets, it seemed, could do anything. While women poets sat home and knitted, male poets could drink themselves silly, have wild affairs, sign on to whaling ships, meet psychotic sea captains and tattooed harpooners, go to war and write poems about the tragic slaughter of young men in ways that brought tears to your eyes. I didn't want to be a man, but like a man, I wanted to be able to do anything and have the whole world as my subject. Most of all, I wanted to have time to write. Clearly, I was going to have to figure out how to support myself in a way that left time for travel and writing. It took me about 4 years to figure out a plan that seemed to have at least some chance of allowing me to eat regularly while giving me time to write and see the world. I decided to get a PhD and teach at the college level. Fate cooperated. In the fall semester of my senior year, I sat down to dinner next to a Harvard professor named Richard Evans Schultes. Since I was an English major, I had no idea who he was or what he had done, but we had a pleasant conversation about Charles Dickens, whose novel Pickwick Papers was the subject of my senior honors thesis. It turned out that Professor Schultes was a member of the Boston chapter of the Dickens Society, and he invited me to come to the Old North Church to celebrate Dickens' 153rd birthday. At this point, you may be asking yourself what this chance encounter had to do with how I became a poet, and my reply is everything. After the birthday party, which involved singing Happy Birthday to Mr. Dickens, who, by my calculations, was not going to eat his piece of cake because he had been dead over 100 years, Professor Schultes told me he was in need of a student assistant and asked me if I'd like to take the job. A few days later, I showed up at the Peabody Museum as he had directed, wandered past a stuffed display of the last passenger pigeon, which rumor had it had been shot by a Harvard expedition, and found Professor Schultes, who immediately put me to work cataloging ethnobotanical specimens, which included, among other things, a cake of raw opium, which had lain on a shelf unnoticed for some 60 years, and a tortilla dating from 1897. Before the day was over, I knew that, 1, Professor Schultes was world famous in botanical circles as the father of ethnobotany. 2, ethnobotany was the scientific study of how people use plants. 3, Professor Schultes had spent years living in the jungles of Central and South America, collecting plant specimens and learning from the people who lived in the jungle how those plants were used. And 4, that photo of the guy on the wall dressed in a loincloth having snuff blown up his nose by 2 half-naked men who were only wearing feathers was the same person as the Harvard professor in the 3-piece tweed suit who had hired me to be his student assistant. This time, there was no sudden revelation. Only gradually, as I worked in the Harvard Ethnobotanical Collection, did I realize the final things I needed to do to become a writer. I needed to live like Professor Schultes in some remote location beyond the comforts of civilization. I needed odd, unpredictable experiences. I needed the ecstasy and terror of nature in its original state. I needed to find a place on this planet where trees outnumbered people. In short, I needed danger and I needed to survive it. The summer after I graduated from Harvard, I went to Costa Rica, to a place where trees, mosquitoes, and possibly poisonous snakes outnumbered people. For the next 6 years, I lived off and on at the University of Michigan, where I was pursuing a doctoral degree, and at a remote field station in the middle of the jungle. Sometime during those 6 years, I became a poet. All the pieces were in place: vision, craft, subject, a wider world, time to write, and the means to do so without having to worry about frozen ink, although malaria was always a consideration. Yet, until I was well into my 50s, the jungle itself was not the subject of my poetry. It was instead the silent muse behind my poems, the place where I found the unspoken and non-human, the place where, far from civilization, I could contemplate the mysteries of what lies inside human beings, both below and above 106 degrees Fahrenheit.
I didn't become a poet by getting an MFA. I became a poet by running high fevers, tramping through tropical jungles, dodging machine gun fire, being caught in volcanic eruptions, swarmed by army ants, stalked by vampire bats, threatened by poisonous snakes. And then there was reading.